Nate, you didn't think you needed to go to college, right?
I didn't go to college, no. I taught myself a lot at home. I got bored quite easily in school, and I really liked computers and the internet and writing. And at one point, I thought I was going to be an astrophysicist. It's a little difficult to do that without a degree. And at one point, I thought I was going to be a heavy metal drummer, which I can still do.
That's quite the range. We're different in this way. I needed the classroom, the structure, the teacher, the students. But when we think about AI, I mean, it's turning education, and especially educators' jobs, just totally on its head.
And I think what's so interesting about this generative AI world that we now have is that a lot of the teachers are having to learn at the same time as the students. They're learning what is the role in the classroom.
But they don't have a syllabus for it. That's really tough.
Yeah, exactly. So let's talk to two people who are dealing with this head on right now.
Bring in the professors.
Andrea Jones-Rooy, Professor of Data Science at NYU, and as I'm made aware just now, the first professor I've ever interviewed who I've also seen bend over backwards turning on a stove with her feet.
Yes.
Never used that as a credit for anyone before, but it's true, right?
We don't normally lead with it, but it is true, yes. I do circus and contortion training, and so...
Casual,
yeah. And so I have a coach who coaches over Zoom, and so I do it in my kitchen, and for safety, I use my oven to balance.
Meanwhile, in AI...
Right.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, we've got a lot to talk about, and one of the things I thought we could talk about in particular first is the process of basically kids getting into college.
Okay.
Because one thing we talked about ahead of time is how generative AI, much as we could talk about it about exams and essays and stuff, and we may do, you said that it's actually an issue with the application process itself, even getting into college. Can you just talk us through your experience and what you've seen?
Yeah, so I work on the admissions committee for the master's program in data science at NYU, and I have no hard evidence that anyone, I'm not making any claims that anyone is using AI, generative AI, to write essays. But having read thousands and thousands and thousands of these essays over the years, I would be shocked if students don't start using generative AI to write these essays. My optimistic take on this is maybe generative AI will start to make them a little bit more interesting for those of us who have to read the application.
Well, what about the other side to this, which is, do you see a world in which AI is making the decision that you're making, or will it have to be a person that's kind of looking through the, the holistic application package?
That's such a good question, because I think it's very telling. So I work with companies a lot who want to use AI, either generative AI or good old-fashioned natural language processing AI and all these other things to figure out who to hire. And they are all obsessed, and companies do this, right? They have all these algorithms that scan the resumes and they optimize over this and they try to do this. I think it's very telling how little I trust that whole process, that at the Center for Data Science, we read all applications manually. And that's basically because there is no way to really optimize someone's talent. We don't have good measures for those things yet. And I don't quite know how the generative AI that we have now, I could come back here a year from now and be like, well, we did it. I don't have a job. That's great. Fine. I'll do something else, right? I don't need to read these essays anymore. But I don't think we're there even in the numeric data to actually figure out who's going to be most likely to succeed based on these things. And so I'm not sure how generative AI would do that in this case.
All right, so what about the role of critical thinking? Because this is an area of, it's intense debate around AI, particularly in education as well, that, teaching students of any age the role of critical thinking is critical.
Yeah.
What does that look like in the classroom?
It's very, very difficult, especially, I think, in my field, to get the critical thinking across. I don't even know that I have a good definition of critical thinking. Sometimes I talk about it as data thinking to my students just to get them to listen. Because really when people come to take a data science course, they're like, I'm gonna learn how to program. And you say, well, okay, you're definitely gonna do some programming because that's how we're gonna do the data science analysis. We're gonna learn some statistics. That's not a shock to them either. But then there are so many units, probably a third of my semester is spent saying like, okay, let's think about whether or not this data reflects the reality we're trying to better understand. Let's think about what the accuracy in this machine learning algorithm, whether having it too high is actually going to make us less predictive in the future. Like this requires thinking about what are the ethical implications of taking all this data and then putting it out in the world. And all of that requires sitting down and thinking very carefully in a room. And my students have a lot of resistance to that because they think data science is just sitting down like Mr. Robot and programming, like a hacker. But data science is a very creative and imaginative exercise that requires going forward in a lot of uncertainty. Uncertainty as to whether your analysis is going to work out, uncertainty as to whether your data is accurate, uncertainty into what you should even be doing. There's a million different algorithms you could use at any given time. And deciding what path to go down requires so much thought, so much expertise, so much trust.
How has what you have seen over the past even 6 months, but let's say a couple of years, changed how you think the role of examination is evolving and perhaps should evolve?
Yeah, first I'm going to overshare because this is 100% true. I had a dream, there we go. But I had a dream last night that I went in and there were no chairs. And I was just like, how are my students going to take an exam without a chair? And I woke up and was like, is this the best my imagination has? Like, what are we doing here? So, all right. So I don't think that our exams are actually measuring what I want to measure. And that's, I think, a problem that I am working on. But I think once, generative AI is just out in full force, which it may already be, I think the old-fashioned in-person exams, unfortunately, are going to be where we have to stay. Because you do at some point need to say, well, what do you have in your head that you can say to us? If I had unlimited bandwidth, my ideal exam for a data science student would be to come in and let's talk for an hour, and I'll give you a data set and a couple of questions about what I might want to understand, and watch them walk through it and talk to me about the decisions they're making, the analyses they're conducting, why they're doing it, and the shortcomings in that analysis and what they do next. That's what I would do. Yeah.
On the topic of imagination and creativity, we had another guest talk to us about the potential AI has to kind of unlock more time in the human brain to devote to other things. And what's your take on it?
Right. I share some of that optimism in the sense that, I compare it to Google becoming a thing when I was in college. We're talking before that we're
Ask
millennials.
Jeeves.
Ask Jeeves, like all those things.
Dogpile, what was the other?
Dogpile. You're the first person I've met who is genuinely as excited. Dogpile.
The fetch button.
Yeah.
So good. Yeah. My question though is, and that will likely happen now, as you get better, we're talking before, like as you get better at Googling things, you can get to the answer you need and you can use it and you can move on. And if you're debugging code or you're trying to find something or figure something out, that's very, very fast. My pessimism around all of this, and that could be accelerated with generative AI, my pessimism is that I don't know that I'm doing anything more special with my time now that I'm not going and looking up a microfiche at the library.
Do you think we're teaching them the right sort of skills and teaching them these are the right tools to be taught with? Because when I think back to my childhood, and you tell me if this is different for you, because we all seem to be around the same age, my teacher at one point, Mrs. North, told me that it was essential I knew how to use a protractor.
Yeah.
Right?
Right.
What is the modern equivalent of you must know how to use a protractor?
Ooh, that's a good question. Okay, here's my controversial answer to that is I think actually regular old-fashioned coding might be the protractor of, say, 20 years. Have me back in 20 years and we'll see if I was right. All right?
So full-on linear line-by-line code.
Linear line-by-line coding. Because, and this, I might be biased because I'm not a computer scientist. I am a data scientist, meaning I don't build the hammers. I say, oh, what a cool hammer, and I maybe add a few things, and then I write my program. So maybe I'm missing some deep programming that's still going to be required. But already, I taught myself how to program, and most people who teach themselves, you find a program that kind of does what you were hoping to do, and you take that, and then you modify it, and then you have a program.
What about faculty? How do you see them reacting to all of this?
As far as I can tell, faculty are in a huge panic. That's where I'm seeing, the circles that I'm in are largely faculty-based, and so whether it's from in my university as far as, missives coming from higher-ups about how to handle generative AI, we get more emails about generative AI, I think, than we got in the early days of COVID when everything was shutting down. It was like, hey, you're gonna go online for 2 weeks? Don't ask questions. Every 3 days, we're like, here's another workshop on ChatGPT and how to integrate it in the classroom, how to detect cheating.
And do you have a big prediction for AI in education?
I think education is going to have a huge reckoning. I think that education has skated by, at least higher education, has skated by with tuition rates being sky high, conversations around are we trying to get people jobs or teach critical thinking and crises about what we're even trying to do, whether a 4-year degree is worth it, getting through COVID. There's been some serious headwinds against higher education, and I think it's been long overdue. I think generative AI and AI in general is going to cause us to really rethink what we're even doing in education, because we can't keep telling ourselves that we're here to teach them how to do code or have these tangible skills, because you can teach yourself all of those things. There's something in there with the critical thinking that we need to be much more clear about. We need to make it more affordable. And I think education just needs to start to be more honest about what our value add is, because what we think the value add is, or at least what we're telling our students the value add is rapidly being replaced.
Andrea Jones-Rooy, it's been great to have you in. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Dr. Pamela Gay, it's great to have you here, astrophysicist and senior scientist at the Planetary Science Institute.
You're also an educator.
Yes.
How is AI impacting your work with your students as it relates to, space and astrophysics?
It's this weird new realm where, on one hand, as someone who has to grade students' ability to understand things, I can no longer trust homework to be as original as I might once have hoped. But at the same time, we're able to start creating dynamic testing environments where the software goes, okay, so clearly you understand this. Let me go jump over here. And we've been working on this with more sophisticated testing algorithms since the early 2000s. The GREs, the SATs, all these standardized tests have been becoming more and more adaptive to really figure out what students do and don't know. This also means that students who need extra help learning will be able to get that extra help if they have access to technology. And this is where we're going to see, I fear, an even greater digital divide, where we've seen during the pandemic students trying to do all their schoolwork through a phone, because that's all they had.
And that's what they grew up with.
And it's what they grew up with, while other children have access to multiple monitors on a high-end gaming computer.
Are there any breakthroughs that you see happening in artificial intelligence as it relates to astrophysics and space that previously were unthinkable before?
Well, we always had this sense that someday we'll be able to train the machines to find the things that we know about, to take a page out of a manual and say, this is what galaxies look like, I shall identify galaxies. And that's what supervised machine learning is. But what we're learning is computers can go so much further now. They can actually go through and identify all the things we know and then say, all these points of light, I don't know what these points of light are, but let me break them into groups based on these different little things about how they light up the sky. And this way of doing what's called unsupervised learning to make their own discoveries is allowing us to find things we didn't even know existed.
One of the amazing numbers, and you have many amazing numbers that you talked about, but one of the most amazing that I've recently heard you talk about is that 17 million rocks is not enough rocks to train an AI to identify other rocks.
It's true.
How is that possible?
17 million rocks sounds like a lot of rocks.
It is.
Even in a galactic sense, that's a lot to train. So can you talk us through how you figured that out and what that means for AI?
So I got to work with the OSIRIS-REx mission as they worked to find a place that we could safely go and reach out and touch OSIRIS-REx and grab a sample to bring back to Earth. And we had to find some place that was flat enough that there wouldn't be anything to endanger the spacecraft as it got close enough to Bennu to touch it. And we also wanted to know, were there rocks suitably sized where we were coming down that we could pick them up? Now, unfortunately, Bennu is basically a rubble pile. And with all these different rocks that come in all sorts of different colors and all sorts of different shapes, our software couldn't just look and say, okay, that's a boulder, I shall measure its longest axis. That's a rock, I'm just gonna say that's a rock. This sophistication that human brains have, the software has to be trained on each different color variety, each different shape variety. It can't generalize the way people can. And it turned out that we needed human beings. We used citizen science, community science to map out all those rocks and boulders and craters and help find someplace safe for our mission.
Let's talk space trash, because
Yes.
I didn't realize that it's not just like a bag of Doritos hanging out in the atmosphere near the low Earth orbit. Talk to us about why it's so dangerous and how it intersects with the advancements that artificial intelligence is kind of unlocking in this ability to be able to pinpoint exactly what things are.
Right. So we currently have order of 35,000 fairly large fractions of a meter to multi-meter objects in space.
And they're moving very, very quickly.
They're moving
So
very,
it's not
very
like as
quickly.
if I threw a bag of Doritos at Nate.
No.
This is like
No, orbiting the planet every 90 minutes at roughly the altitude of the space station, so about 400 kilometers up.
As a point of comparison, if a Dorito or any other confectionery item of similar mass was orbiting the Earth once every 90 minutes and hit the ISS,
Yes.
what kind of impact would that have?
If the Dorito and the ISS were going at right angles to one another, so we have now put the Dorito on a polar orbit, it could puncture at least the outer layers of the ISS's multiple layers of protective materials. It would not be a good day for anyone. And we have actually had to move the ISS to get it out of the way of debris more than once and send astronauts to go hide in the slightly more robust capsules that are attached to the International Space Station. It's estimated there could be order of millions of objects, 1 millimeter and larger, circling our planet. And it's starting to be a real concern because for some of the launch windows for spacecraft going to the International Space Station, going to very specific orbits, we have what are called instantaneous launch windows, which means you either launch at the moment you're supposed to launch or you don't go. And if a piece of space junk just happens to pass over where you're trying to launch, you can't launch. And it's difficult to track all these objects, and companies like OneWeb and Starlink and all these different constellations are adding hundreds of satellites per month in some cases.
So as far as artificial intelligence is concerned, there's a real advantage here to basically keep track and predict the position and potentially the collisions between multiple objects in a way that humans in real time just cannot do.
It's a matter of, we have a variety of different organizations out there that are either measuring positions with radar, using laser ranging, and sometimes just looking at things and imaging through telescopes. They're bringing all of the data together. Space Force is one of the organizations here in the US that does this. And they're every single day working to update what we know about the orbits of objects. And this can get strangely complicated. Things like a solar flare can cause our atmosphere to get bigger, which causes the satellites to experience more drag and go slower and change their orbits. We're one good solar flare from having a whole lot of objects change their motions. And it's going to require computers matching, all right, so we now see all of these different motions going on. We're going to match these things to what was happening yesterday and try and keep track of where things were, where things are going, and try and prevent anything from intersecting as it travels.
What else is getting you really excited in the astrophysics world? We've talked about space debris, we've talked about
Doritos,
we've talked about 17 million rocks not being enough rocks. But what excites you when you think about that and the potential of what you're seeing in machine learning and AI and computer vision and so on to solve some of those fundamental questions?
At the most fundamental level, machine learning is able to tease out small details that our human eye will just gloss over because we're distracted by all the bright, beautiful things in our images. And what we're finding with the new data coming from the JWST is when we look at galaxy clusters of hundreds to thousands of galaxies, the vast amount of gravity this cluster has is able to bend the light from background objects and bend it like a lens that allows us to see objects that would otherwise be too faint because they're so far away. This is called gravitational lensing. And we are finding objects that were literally shining their light towards us 300 million years, 400 million years after the Big Bang. And they're just like these faint little smudges of light that look like nothing. But software can find them, identify them, de-smudge them to a certain degree, and allow us to see what the first galaxies to form actually looked like.
But it is interesting that a lot of the minds in space now, perhaps the buzziest names, whether it's Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk, you know, they also have influence in other fields, technology, but also artificial intelligence. And in particular, Elon Musk was one of the founders of OpenAI. And, you know, whether or not people speculate about him launching his own large language model or AI capabilities, what does that portend for space, especially because he does have a pretty big role in that as well? What do you think of that?
I think that the potential is limitless, and where it's going to matter the most is in places that we aren't necessarily thinking. I have a good friend who's visually impaired, and he lives in the future. His house is governed by Siri and Cortana and Google, and he can move through life as ably as anyone else because of these digital assistants, because of the natural language models. And when you're confined in this kind of an area, it's the artificial intelligence that are going to make the difference in terms of well-being, in terms of communications, in terms of helping you just get through with so much. It's the ultimate tiny house. And just as we're seeing AI allow amazing tiny house transformations, if we're going to Mars, spending 6 months in a little tiny spacecraft, you're going to want your digital assistant who's there knowing, hey, would you like this music? Your heart rate seems elevated.
So it might not be a terrible thing that perhaps some of these other tech minds are piling on. And
well, hell was there to teach us a lesson in A Space Odyssey, but I think it's more likely that we're going to have the assistants telling us to take a deep breath and read a good book and then get back to work.
Dr. Pamela Gay, it's been a great pleasure to talk to you. Thank you so much for joining us and blowing our minds slightly.
Thank you. It's always a pleasure.
Well, speaking as somebody who didn't go to college, I'm really glad I finally got to learn from some professors.
I love that for you, but you eked out without having to do any group projects.
Yeah, that is true.
Next time.
Yeah.
But really, when it comes to AI, we're all still students in a way.
True.